All right, good deal. Got my new microphone since my other one was messing up on me last class, so today's going to be a good day, I think. We're going to continue today with working through the code on your Raspberry Pi version of Space Invaders. If you do have your Raspberry Pis, please go ahead and get them set up. If you don't, it's going to be just like it was on Monday, where we'll just be following along with me for today. So I am going to give you a couple minutes, if you have not already, to set up your Raspberry Pis. I'm going to put hands down. Please raise your hand if you have it set up or cannot get it set up. Basically, I'm just seeing that everybody's ready, and if you can't get the Pi working, then you are okay. I'm not mad or anything. It's gonna keep on going where we ended off last class. If you did the 6 o'clock webinar last on Monday, we got a little bit farther than we did in our 4 p.m. webinar. So if you did do the 6 p.m. webinar, you will be going through some review with me today. So that's going to be okay. Nothing wrong with extra review. So if you're just showing up, you're raising your hand if you have your Raspberry Pi set up, or you cannot get your Raspberry Pi set up for today. And I'll wait another minute or so before I get started so that I don't leave anybody behind. You're raising your hand if you have your Raspberry Pi and you have it set up, and you're raising your hand if you cannot set up your Raspberry Pi for today. Alright, the question is, you've done this before, so you're going to watch, and that's totally fine. Because, yeah, you mentioned you had done Scratch before, so. Question, are we working with our Pis today? Yes, if you can get it set up. But if you can't, you can also follow along. Alright. So where I'm going to get started is where we left off in this class, last class, which was somewhere around the point where we discussed, where was that? Where we discussed the positioning for every individual invader. We talked about how the broadcast blocks sort of have a flow to them where once one thing is initialized, it will initiate the next thing, and so on and so forth until we get to portions of the game where we can actually run it. So, see a question here. We're going to be doing the same stuff we did on Monday, but towards the end of class, depending on how we look on time, I am going to let you go ahead and mess around with some of the code that we go over. Now that you know, or by then you'll know sort of what everything does, and you are actually able to change some values, maybe add some extra code for, say, a game over screen maybe. I don't know, I haven't quite thought about that far ahead yet. I'm just going, you know. Happy it's a beautiful day outside for once. But anyways, this is where we got last class, just discussing the invader's position and a little bit about the state of the invader. Specifically, the invader's state being set to 2 or it's 0. I think that's where I left off. Any questions on what we did last class? So if there are no questions, I'm going to start discussing the run game piece of code. Because this is a really complicated bit of code that even took me a little bit of thinking to understand sort of how it worked. So I guess we'll go ahead and start with the run game broadcast. Obviously there's all sorts of crazy if statements, piece of code here. With this run game broadcast being done, we can actually add some more stuff to our flowchart. All the initialization stuff ended up with the first 6 broadcasts, but there are at least 6 more. Move invaders, launch bomb, launch missile, hit, invader hit, and mother hit, among others, that can now be activated. So I believe that you can find this code on any of the invaders that are sprites in your game. So when we receive the run game broadcast, we're going to go into a finite loop. Specifically, we're going to be going into a repeat until loop. So it's going to keep on going until a condition is met. So it's sort of like an if statement mixed with a finite loop. And obviously we're going to do a whole ton of stuff while this game is running until it stops running, which, given this condition here, means that we're going to stop this loop and the invaders will stop moving. So I think I just explained that. The game running will become 0, meaning it's false. Remember, that's a Boolean variable. It's going to be either 0 or 1. So while the game is running, which it should be by now, the loop is going to be running as well. This script should be found on your invaders. This should be where you're somewhere in your invaders. There's a lot of code in your invader so. So while the game is indeed running, the game is, you have checked 5 or so of them, it's not in any. Let's see then. There's a couple places it could be in. If it's not there, it could be in the background. Does anybody have their Pi on and can tell me where exactly they find this piece of code? If it's not in invaders, I'm assuming it's background. It is background? Okay. Good deal. So the way that we set our invader speed, basically, the closer to 0 that it gets, the faster it's going to go. So it's a little bit weird. But we're actually going to wait the amount of time that the invader... Sorry, let me restart saying that. The invader... Wow. I'm so tongue-tied. The invader speed is just a variable that we use to pause between each movement that our invaders make. So it's not actually a speed, but the lower this number goes, the shorter that it will pause. Our invaders are programmed to move 10 steps, and if we waited a second, it would move 10 steps, wait a second, go 10 more steps. So with a very, very small value for invader speed, the game is going to start going faster. Later on in our code, we'll see that the invaders are set to move a little bit faster as the other invaders start getting killed. So this value will change as the game is being played. It will then define the invader's movement boundaries. But I don't mean that your invader is going to be able to move between -999 and 999. These variables are actually being set for something we'll see in just a second here. we're actually going to be resetting these variables to be actual, real numbers that our invaders will actually be moving between. They also will be used to set some code up for the invaders' bombs. So we'll use that in just a second. And finally, it sends in a message to the invaders telling them to move. So before we keep going with the run game, let's take a look at this move invaders piece of code, which is indeed in your invaders sprites. Okay. So this is probably the most abstract, most similar to real programming piece of code in the game here. So let's take a look at it. When the invader senses that it's supposed to move, the first thing it's going to do is go into an if statement. So it's going to check if the invader is alive. If you remember before, we set our invader state to 2, and it will prevent anything happening to the invader if it's supposed to be dead. So while this invader is indeed alive and happy, it will move by the values specified in the variables that were initiated earlier, invader dx and invader dy. Remember that fun calculus stuff? I believe we had 10 for dx and 0 for dy. Dx is going to be its change in x, if you remember. In dy, it's going to be its change in y. Later on, we will have a piece of code that will set this invader change in y, which will make it move down and change direction. So we'll also be changing dx later as well. So this if statement that is nested within this other if statement, it has the same condition. So to be honest, I'm not entirely sure if this extra if statement's even needed. If anyone wants to correct me or see what happens if it's taken out, just make sure to keep the if-else statement inside of it. That would be awesome, because I'm not entirely sure if you actually need this if right here. But what this little piece of code inside of it does, it will switch between and costumes of your invaders. I believe your invaders each have 3 costumes. The first of which is going to be called open. So it's going to open its little arms or tentacles or whatever that is. And then, that's the first costume. If it is on the second costume, it will change back to the first costume. So that prevents it from displaying its third costume, which is the explosion costume. And it's pretty cool, actually, what they do with the explosion costume. I'll show you a little bit later in the class how they give the illusion of making a actively occurring explosion. So every time this loop runs, it's going to receive new x and y coordinates. Alright. So for Invader 1, for example, it's going to set these x and y coordinates to the current x and y positions of that invader. So this is always going to be changing every time this loop is running, for every single invader. Okay? So we're just setting these coordinates for the next couple of if statements here. The next 3 statements will check the minimum and maximum positions of the invaders, as well as the minimum y position, based on the newly stored position, the one right above it, of the invader. Now, if you remember, invader max x we had set to -999. So basically any x value that the invader is set to will be greater than this invader max x value. So if that's the case, we set our new invader max x value to x. Similarly, invader min x, which we had set earlier to 999, x will be less than that 999. So we reset the min x to x as well. And finally, the same thing for the y. There's a reason we're doing this, even though it might not seem so concrete right now. The last if statement we've got here is a little bit different. It's going to give, basically, a 1 in 5 chance of setting new coordinates, which will be used for the bomb. Now, the invaders are the ones that will shoot the bombs, but what this is going to do is say if we pick a random number between 1 and 100, if that number is less than 20, which will be, a 1 in 5 chance, we're going to set some extra variables, specifically bomb x and bomb y, to be that same x and y position. So this right here will place a bomb at a certain invader's position. Well, if there's a 1 in 5 chance it'll do that. So for all the invaders, there's a 1 in 5 chance they will try and bomb you. Alright. And it's a risk I'm willing to take. You can always make that number bigger or smaller if you want to make the game harder. You can always make a 50% chance. So pick random 0 to 100, less than 50, and they'll bomb you a lot more frequently and destroy your shields. So at this point, let's go back into our background sprite and go back into the run game broadcast. So I cut it off here, but there is a bunch of code above, and I think there's some below as well. This is just sort of the middle meaty section of it. This next if statement we've got here is actually going to check if a bomb has been detected. Right, so if a bomb is not active and bomb x is less than 999, so if you remember from here, a 20% chance that bomb x will have a value that is less than 999. It's basically just checking that new coordinates have been stored within this variable before it launches the bomb. And I'm sorry, I think I miswrote this in my PowerPoint here. Should be a 1 for now. My bad. So we'll go into the launch bomb statement in just a second here. Yeah, just a second, like I said. Now, the next if-else statement, so it's going to be this whole chunk right here, it's going to deal with the movement of the invaders. So initially, invader dy was set to 0, so that it wouldn't change its position at all in the y direction. There is going to be another piece of code later on that will change invader dy to be something that's not 0, and that's when this little piece of code right here will run. This piece of code just resets the invader's change in the y direction to 0, so that it doesn't keep going down after it switches directions. And it will set the invader dx to be the next invader dx. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned it yet, but there is yet another variable called next invader dx. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, next invader dx will specifically refer to the next one on the line, but I'm not entirely sure. I can't remember. It basically just resets invader dx. It's always going to be 10 or negative 10. It's just a switch in direction. It's going to be going positive or negative. It's just resetting it so it doesn't keep moving into the wall and on forever. So within the else part of this if statement, we have a couple more if statements. These will deal with the invader's movement at the minimum and maximum x values. So basically what I was talking about up here in this statement, this is where we actually do change the value for invader dy and invader dx and next invader dx. Okay, so our limit on the positive x direction is going to be about 210, meaning that it's going to be 210, you know, I don't know if it's pixels, but it's coordinates in the positive x direction. If we sense that the invader has exceeded this, what we're going to do is make it stop by setting invader dx to 0, move down by changing the y direction to -20, and setting our next invader dx to -10. So this is assuming that the invader has been going in the positive x direction, meaning the invader dx is 10, and we'll switch it to go into the negative x direction, so going towards the left, by -10 each time it waits. The next if statement's the same, except it's for the negative x variable. It'll just move down your invaders by 20 and set it going back into the positive directions, right? The last if statement here actually acts as a fail-safe. If you remember, when we looked in the move invaders block, we did make sure that the variable for invader max x changed to the invader's current x position. So if there is no change in this value, remember we did set it initially to be -999, then we're just going to stop the game because something's going awry. It's just a fail-safe here. Yep, and ensures the game will cease to run. Alright, so I think this is more on the run game. This will also set the invader's minimum y value. So just like before with that invader max x, the invader min y is going to set a minimum value for the invaders. You set your player's character to -150 or so, but what this is saying is if the invader gets to this point, -130, it's going to hit you at some point very, very soon, and it's going to broadcast that you're dead. So that's one way to die. We'll explain the others later. We haven't yet set any collision controls for what happens during any collision yet, so we'll get there in a second. So it's basically just going to stop the game. We'll discuss more about the broadcast for dead later on. Actually, I'm sorry, I think I misspoke. Because if the invader min y goes below -130, we're going to pop out of the if statement. And here we go. That's when we're going to talk about if the y value is too low, it'll kill us. Otherwise, it's going to wait a second just to make sure all the explosions have completed. If we still have some lives left, what's going to happen is we're going to basically restart the level, except the invaders are going to be 30 y units below where they initially started. So that waits just to make sure the explosions have stopped. And yes, there are explosions, because yay explosions. So I did talk about that. The script resets all the pen drawings. I'll tell you a little bit later about the pen. But yeah, I agree. I love explosions. And the way they do explosions in this game is so cool. I can't wait to lecture on that. So So before we go into, I guess before we go into collisions, let's review real quick the player's response to the run game broadcast. Raleigh and Harrisburg, I think, when we messed with our joysticks, this is the main script that we were messing around with. So, first thing that it'll do is always be checking if the game is running. So while the game is running, if the right arrow is pressed, we're going to go right, meaning direction 90 degrees. When the right arrow is clicked, it's going to move 8 steps, and it will stop at the edges of our screen. And similarly for the left arrow. So when we did code the joystick, I don't know if Charlotte has done the joystick lab yet. Here is where we added if the right arrow is pressed, or the GPIO sensor is sensing that the joystick is pointing rightwards. That's where we added that right here. We also set our space bar to be an input, making sure that the missiles will fire when the space bar is pressed. So basically, you did a little bit of the joysticks, but you didn't get too far. Okay. We didn't either, at least in our Raleigh labs. So that's probably about where you all are at too then. So cool. Good to know. Thank you. So basically, this last if statement is going to set the space bar to fire a missile. So it's going to set the missile to be active, whereas before it was inactive. And then it's going to broadcast that we're going to launch the missile. And here's actually where it gets fun, because we finally get to add collisions and yada yada yada. So right now we're going to go over into the bomb sprite, and we're going to take a look at the launch bomb broadcast block. So these bombs are going to be the invaders projectiles. They are going to harm your player and your player's shield. So if you remember when we set the variables for bomb X and bomb Y, this is where this comes into play. These first couple lines just deal with the bomb's initial position and movement. So our bombs are active, so we set that to be 1. This is yet another Boolean variable. If they're not active, obviously it's going to be 0. So it sets the bomb's position to be at the same position as the invader. So it looks like the invader is going to be shooting it. Pointing in direction 180 is just going to make sure that it goes downwards on your screen or in the negative Y direction. And then you're going to show it. Because if we don't show it, that's going to be a really sneaky bomb. So that could actually be kind of fun. If you give maybe a 1 in 100% chance of having an invisible bomb, that could be pretty cool. That'd be very, very cruel though. So I've already told you where the code collects the variables for bomb X and Y, which would be in the move invaders broadcast block. A 20% chance is there for these variables to be stored, meaning there's a 20% chance for your bombs to, or for your invaders to spawn bombs. And then we go into a very, very large repeat until loop. This loop is going to terminate if the bomb becomes inactive for whatever reason inside of this loop here. It could happen because it hits something or it hits nothing. So no matter what, it's going to become inactive at some point here. It's also set to terminate if the game is won or lost. when the variable called game running goes to 0. And Cameron is saying 3 in 10 chance of there being a bomb and 10% chance of it being invisible. Yeah, I mean, honestly, it depends on how you change the code to be more, sneaky and stuff. So, Cameron, if you want to do that, put that stuff on up in Modo. I'd love to see it. I guess you can't really put it on Modo since we're in using the Pi, but I guess you can always code this too on the Scratch website. So, anyway. The bomb speed, I believe, is a function of... it is a variable, but I do think that it's just set by the programmer. I don't think that there's anything changing this, so it's just going to be one constant. The lower that the speed is set, just like with the invader's movement, the faster that your bomb will be moving downwards. The bomb is also going to continue changing costumes. How that looks, I'm not entirely sure. I guess it would just be... I don't even know. I can't even imagine why or what other costumes the bomb has. But it will continually change costumes, so. The next if statement we've got here is going to make sure the bomb stays on the screen. So if you all remember, we made sure that our invaders can't go below -130 in the Y position, or the Y direction. So if it goes to the bottom of our screen here, below even our player character, the bomb will become inactive and disappear. So that's just if a bomb does nothing. If a bomb just gets launched, doesn't hit anything, doesn't hit our shield or our character. So this is going to actually make it have an effect on our player's shield. And I think this is really cool how they did that. If you look on some of the other versions of Space Invaders on Scratch 2.0, the way they change the shields when they get hit, a lot of them will use different sprites or change costumes. But the way that this one works is the bomb sprite effectively becomes a pen on the screen and will draw sort of a black line within your shield. Okay. So if the bomb is touching this color here, which is unique to the shields, your shields in this game are this color, it is still going to move. It's going to move down -20, which will still be inside the shield. It's going to set up, or set the pin color to be black, and it's going to set the pin size to be the same size as the bomb. It's going to then put the pen down, meaning it's going to, pencil to paper, and then it's going to bring the pen up. So what this essentially is going to do is create a hole in your shield the same size as the bomb for -20 coordinates, and it will then deactivate the bomb. So this is literally just going to change the sprite itself. I think it's really clever what they did here, though. So if you wanted to see how this works, you can actually change your pen color to, say, maybe bright pink. So you can see how that changes it. That could be fun. It is awesome. I definitely agree there. It's just, especially looking at other Scratch Space Invaders games, it's just like, wow. It makes so much sense. I don't know why I didn't think of it. But anyways, the last if statement, yeah, very clever. Very much so. The last one here actually does collisions with the player. It checks to see if the bomb is touching the player. And if it is, it will broadcast to the player that the ship's been hit, and then deactivate the bomb, and will then hide it until it is being used again. So that's for the bombs. The next one we're going to talk about is launching our missile. Now, before we talk about what happens when anything else gets hit, we're going to talk about the missile. And this is the one that your player launches to hurt the invaders. So earlier on in this code, we talked about how the missile was set to be launched just by clicking the spacebar. But once the launch missile broadcast is received by your missile sprite, the X and Y position of the missile will be set to the same position as our player. Why do we do this, though? This isn't anyone to answer. Why would we set this missile to be at the same position as our player? Anyone? I talked about it earlier. Well, I'm asking, why would we want this to be the case? It's not that it will kill you. It's because we want it to come out of the top of our ship. So the missile is, again, what we're going to be using to kill the invaders. It will not kill us, unless we do something real wrong. That should never happen. So just like we did in our game. About to say that, but you type slow. That's okay. It's sort of rhetorical, sort of just a reminder as to why we're doing it. The rest of this stuff here is going to make sure the missile moves upwards, so pointing in direction 0. It's going to go upwards in the Y direction, so it's going to change Y by 10. It's going to show our missile, and it's going to play a sweet laser sound. Laser cut. So let's go to a quick aside here about the sounds menu. What's up, Marissa? Laser cut. It's a thing, I promise. You'll hear me say laser cut about 50 million times. Especially if you see me with a laser cutter down in Charlotte. Anyways, you can record or use pre-existing sounds in your game. It'll make your game immersive and silly. So that's what they're doing here. And yes, Marissa knows this very well, that I do talk about laser cut. But I can't remember where this code is going to be set. I think this might be in the background. But let's look at the background music real quick. In fact, yeah, it's probably the background, just judging by this nice thing right there. When the game's getting ready to be played, it's going to be set here. It's always going to be playing this sound until the game is over. You can see that in the forever statement. If play music is on, it's going to play the abstract mix. Which is, I guess, the spacey, invaders-y thing. And then it's going to repeat. Now we do have to set the volume for any sound being used, so we just set it to 100%, just as a default. When the game is over, or when something else happens, the variable set to play the music will become 0 and we'll stop it. Is there one at 6? Yes, most definitely. There is going to be a webinar at 6. just like always. Alright. So back sort of to the launch missile broadcast here. After we have the sweet laser sound, it's going to set a variable called done to 0, which is going to sort of control the behavior and showing of the missile. So the missile is going to be shown until something in the repeat loop happens. Either the missile has done its job, doesn't need anything anymore, it is done, it's true, or the game is not running. So while the missile has not done its job and the game is still running, it's going to fly upwards by changing Y by 10. Oops. And it's also going to check on the Y position of our missile. So just like how we set our negative Y boundary to be, negative 150, we're going to set our, we're going to check to see if our Y position in the positive Y direction hits the top of our screen. At that point, it will set the missile to be done, and I think later on I'll show a little bit more about that. So if you all remember how you coded, this is the next piece, it's not just random. If you guys remember how we coded the bomb to carve into the player's shield, we can do the same here. And this actually reminded me of a quote from Futurama, where Fry goes, "Watch as I fire upwards through our own shield," and everyone gasps and says, "He's a madman." But yes, this is a valid strategy for the game. Oop. But anyways, that code looks the exact same as it did for the bomb code. So if it's touching the color that is the shield, it will basically just set the pen to create a hole in it, just like before. And then it will finish up it'll set the variable to done, meaning that the missile is no longer. So the next little piece of code is going to account for any of the invaders being hit. So there are 3 colors for our invaders: hot pink, bright green, and sort of a light blue color. We use the colors in this case because they are unique to the invaders alone. Just like that dark green is unique to our shields, the invaders are unique to these colors. So if our missile's hitting one of these invaders, it's going to play a sound. It's going to broadcast to the invaders that they've been hit. It's going to speed up the invader. So remember, the invader's speed is really just the wait time between X movements. So making it smaller makes the invaders go faster. And will then terminate the missile's existence, just noticing that it's done its job. So we set done to 1. We also have to code extra for the mothership, because it is a unique sprite as well. If our missile is touching the mothership, that same boom sound is going to get played. We're going to broadcast that the mothership has been hit and that the missile has done its job. So once that missile has accomplished that, remember setting done to 1 is one of our conditions to pop out of the repeat loop. So we're going to make our missile inactive and then hide it. So that's basically everything that does not involve collisions and dying of the invaders, the mothership, or the character. So this is what happens when sprites collide. So the hit broadcast block is broadcast when the player is hit. So when the player's ship is about to go bye-bye. So the first thing we need to do is reduce the amount of lives we have by 1, and so we do such a thing. Surprise, surprise. And we'll go into an if-else loop to check if we have any lives remaining. So if we have lives remaining, after any hit, so after any time that the the bomb or the invader hits your character, what's going to happen is the sprite will quickly be hidden and shown 3 times so that it looks like it blinks. So I'm sure you've seen, in your game that if you die, before it goes to your next life, it's going to blink. That is in a lot of old games, actually, just to indicate that, hey, we saved you, we got you another guy. So if we don't have any lives left, which is the else part of this statement, we're going to play that same boom sound and set the game to stop running. So, nothing surprising there. Now the next part is what I think is really cool, another very clever piece of code in this game. So if we have 0 lives, then play a sound, set the game to stop running. We will switch to our player's other costume at 50% size. So remember, our player has 2 costumes, normal and explosion. So these next 2 repeat loops are just going to give the illusion of the ship exploding. So very quickly, what's going to happen with this first repeat loop is the ship is going to get bigger, meaning that your explosion is going to start getting bigger. And then the explosion is going to get smaller rapidly. So it's actually going to look like it's exploding. I think it's pretty cool how they did that. Finally, the game will broadcast that your player is super dead. Before I go off into the invader and mothership being hit, let's talk about the being dead received. I think this is going to be found in the background, but I'm not entirely sure. Again, I don't have Pi up in front of me working. So let's see what happens when the player does die. So if you remember how we set our music to play when initializing the game, we're actually going to turn that off. The repeat loops actually is what's going to make the turning off happen. It's going to change the volume by 10%, which makes it sound like it's fading out. So it's really, really rapidly changing the volume, just like we did with the costume changes. Going to stop all of our sounds until, with 100% volume, we've got an evil laugh that appears. Wah ha 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 ha. We'll then broadcast the game over and start game broadcasts. This will let the game reset. I don't actually have the code for the game over broadcast in front of me, but I'd assume that it would just tell all of our sprites to stop. And then it will go back into the start game broadcast, which is where we initialize all of our invaders and stuff like that. So it's just resetting our game. Everything is effectively wiped. Alright, talked about that. Let's talk about our invaders being hit. What happens when they get hit by a missile. This first piece of code here is actually just a failsafe. We have this here so that the script does not run again before the code has finished running. Because what would happen if we didn't have this, the half-exploded invaders would still appear on your screen, and we don't necessarily want that. So basically, as soon as we see an invader's hit, the state is going to be dead or 0, and it's going to be hidden. We then go into an if statement, where the invaders are set to react to an incoming missile. What you'd expect, though, here is to see a touching command block. So remember, if touching Mothership, for example, this time we're doing a distance to the missile block and setting that to be less than 20. So if anyone wants to take a guess why this is, that would be awesome. There's a reason that the developer did this. Does anybody know why instead of touching missile, we would do distance is less than 20? It has to do with the sprites themselves. Alright, it's a little bit tricky, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. The sprites themselves, they would overlap. Yes, that's right. They would overlap for a second. And they being the invader and the missile. And break realism, exactly. Not that Space Invaders is real. But yeah, exactly. Basically, this is accounting for the size of the invaders. So the position of the invader is basically set to be the very center of the sprite. I'm not sure how big the sprites are, but I'd have to venture that they're probably bigger than 40 pixels wide. So using the distance being less than 20 would make it so if the missile is touching the very far left side of your invader, then it would still count as a hit. So it does prevent the missile and invader from overlapping, but still registers a hit. So if we indicate a hit, we'll set our invader state to 0, meaning that, hey, it's dead. It will change our score, which is something that is good. There is a score here. And the rest of this code just acts just like our player hit code. So we initiate our costume, change to the explosion costume, and the rest of the code will make the explosion look explodey, as well as hide the dead invader. So this is nothing new here. This is exactly what our player character did. Now, I wasn't able to get a screenshot for the mothership being hit, but I would assume... Oops, I need to take this one out. I need to assume that it's going to be very similar to the Invader Hit situation here. It's probably going to have a broadcast telling us that the game has been won. Quick, hide the dead invader. Yeah, that's basically what it is. Quick, hide it. We don't want to see that anymore. But it's probably as a broadcast telling us the game has been won or that the game is over, and we'll probably use the start game broadcast to reinitialize the game, just like what happened when the player got hit. So, at this point, you've listened to me talk about this for almost 2 hours. I've sort of given you a good baseline on the things you can change, the things you can't change, and why everything works as it does. So I hope that it's meticulous enough for you to feel comfortable changing it, to be easier, harder, have more content, yada yada yada. But remember that if you do change this code, you ought to save as and give it another name so that you don't mess up your initial game. Alright? So, I know this is a very large amount of information to take in. And so as a result, I'm going to give you a couple options here. We're getting close to 5 o'clock in the end of class. If you don't have questions about this, you are free to go for the day. If you do have questions, you are free to ask them, as I will be online until 5. And other than that, I don't have much else. We will be going on to a different topic next week. What that topic is going to be a surprise. And so, yeah. Yeah, if you have to go, I'm actually not sure if it's going to be X-Plane quite yet. It's a surprise to me, too. That's why it's a surprise. But if you have to go, go ahead. No problem. I hope you enjoyed the lesson / dealt with how dense it was today. I'll be on for a couple more minutes here